Wherever people settle, water is their first concern. Sometimes it means building a barrier to provide an adequate water supply. Sometimes it means overcoming the barrier that water can often create. From time to time, these structures of concrete and steel fail us, and an unfinished bridge bends and breaks, taking men down with it. And a mighty dam cracks and crumbles, turning a beautiful valley into a watery tomb. On the French Riviera, it is another day of rain, particularly over the Freijus River Valley. But for the citizens of Freijus, at the base of the valley, it is nothing new. Fall and spring are traditionally very wet, so much so that they actually create a river. Dry in summer, the Freijus River is born in winter and spring, flowing down to Freijus before emptying into the Mediterranean Sea. Like many French villages, there are two parts to Freijus. One is the old town on the hill, where in 1959, Rose Dutot and Marthe Sepi live with their families.
In 1959, I was 28 years old. I worked with my parents, who had a grocery store in the city center, and I already had a 6-year-old daughter.
We lived in the center of town, on the cathedral side, and we were living well. My parents were living on the street just below us.
The ancient houses and streets clustered on the hill are a contrast to the bright, modern villas spreading out on the lowland plains.
At the time, Freijus was primarily an agrarian town, made up of fruit trees and other crops, which required a lot of water.
The properties were around 10 to 15 hectares. My parents had an older farm that dated back to the 19th century. It was like a lot of farms in Provence.
Michelle Merot's family had been farmers for 4 generations, and although she boards at a private school during the week, she has spent most of her 15 years growing up on the farm.
It was a wonderful childhood due to the beauty of the nature.
Like many farmers in the valley, the Merots can look back to days when fields were regularly devastated by floods brought on by heavy rains. That has not been the case since the Malpasset Dam was completed in 1954.
After the war in 1945, our region went through a necessary agricultural and industrial redevelopment and reconstruction.
Et le développement, n'est-ce pas, qui devait se produire après cette guerre, que ce soit un développement agricole, touristique ou industriel, il fallait déjà à cette époque.
At that time, it was important to even the flow of the river, to be able to provide potable water to the city of Freijus, and at the same time, control the river to provide some water for irrigation.
Réguler la rivière et en même temps donner de l'eau pour l'irrigation.
While several sites are considered, officials decide on the steep V-shaped terrain of the Freijus River Canyon, a choice based on geological studies indicating this site to be most favorable.
Les autorités locales, n'est-ce pas, ont donc repris tous ces projets.
In 1947-48, the local officials invited the world-renowned dam builder of the time, Mr. André Coyne, to submit a proposal for their project.
Monsieur André Coyne, n'est-ce pas, de proposer des projets de barrage.
To build the Malpasset, Coyne uses thin concrete walls arched in the direction of the river's downstream pressure. This pressure compresses the walls tightly against the rock, strengthening the dam so that it requires less concrete to build. During construction, the rock foundation is inspected prior to placing the concrete, but no deficient geologic conditions are found.
With all of the samples of concrete which were made, with all of the masses of scrap metal which were put into place, there were no errors in building this dam. We did all that was needed to test the solidity of the dam.
However, adjustments must be made to the dam immediately adjacent to valley walls. While the right side abuts directly to the rock face, a concrete wing is built on the left to close the gap between concrete and canyon. The dam is completed in 1954, and for the next 5 years, the reservoir behind it slowly fills, offering for the first time a controlled water supply to the valley below.
The dam was their life. For my family, it brought happiness because they finally had water. We could finally farm a variety of fruits and vegetables.
By the fall of 1959, the lake behind the Malpasset Dam contains almost 50 billion liters of water. The torrential rains of November have raised the level to near capacity.
It was during this time that they began to notice water leaking on the sides and other small things that troubled the engineers and the local authorities.
We sent technicians who were taking measurements twice a day, and it was one day in November. In one place, they saw a movement of 17 millimeters in the wall. Very little, and the engineer said that's normal because of all the water that has fallen. So no one was too concerned.
C'est normal à compte tenu de l'arrivée de l'eau, c'est une mise en place. On n'a jamais pensé que ça pouvait provoquer, et en fait, ce n'est pas ça qui a provoqué.
By November 30th, 1959, the water level has never been higher. Engineers discuss the possibility of opening the floodgates to relieve the pressure. They decide to wait rather than risk interrupting workers building a highway a kilometer downstream. Rumors about problems with the dam circulate through Freijus. But on December 2nd, Rose Duteau is relieved when the rain diminishes in the afternoon and skies clear enough for her father Leandre to make a change in plans.
In the afternoon, my father decided to go up to the Malpasset because we had a small country house there and we had several dogs there to be fed.
Although the rain has stopped, the water level at the dam is dangerously close to overflowing. At 6 p.m., engineers finally order gatekeeper André Ferraud to release some of the water.
The water flow was only about 40 to 50 cubic meters per second, but behind the dam, there was around 50 million cubic meters, which needed to be released. As it turned out, the decision to open the floodgates came a little too late.
Wednesday, December 2nd, 1959. After weeks of heavy rain, the evening sky above the French Riviera's Rhin Valley is clear and sprinkled with stars. At the family cottage near the Malpasset Dam, 62-year-old Leandre Deschamps settles in for the night. The rest of his family is at home in Freijus, 7 kilometers downstream. Leandre's daughter Rose and her husband are watching television, like many of their neighbors in the town center and on the lower plains. 15-year-old Michelle Moreau is away at school, but her family is at their farm on the outskirts of Freijus.
My parents were watching television with our neighbors, the Grangers, who were also very close friends. My second brother, my brother Gilbert, was watching television with my parents, and my older brother André was tired and went to bed.
Some 1,500 meters downstream from the Malpasset Dam, gatekeeper André Ferraud is also at home with his wife and 3-year-old son. Suddenly, Ferraud hears a loud cracking sound. followed by a violent wind that blows open his doors and windows. The Malpasset Dam cracks like an egg, then blows apart. Its left bank abutment collapses, swept away by the water now rushing past. 50 billion liters of reservoir roar down the Freijus River Valley, a giant wall of water 10 meters high and 500 meters wide. It rips through the hamlet of Malpasset and the autoroute construction site, leaving no survivors behind as it heads for the town of Freijus.
Il aura fallu 20 minutes à la vague.
It would have taken 20 minutes for the water, a huge wave sweeping up everything in its path to arrive at Freijus. And in those 20 minutes, there was a huge disaster. Enormous blocks of concrete were moved as if they were small pebbles, with a vast energy of 50 million cubic meters of water bearing down on Freijus.
Il y avait quand même 50 millions de mètres cubes qui se sont abattus sur Freijus.
At his family farm, André Marot wakens to the sound of his home ripping apart.
Il a sauté de son lit.
He jumped out of bed. Thank God it was the right side of the bed, because half the wall was already gone. He climbed onto the little staircase which led to the attic, thinking that the rest of the family would be there. He also thought to bring his blanket. When he got there, he realized he was by himself. There was noise all around, and he thought he would be taken by the water. He didn't think the house would hold.
The swirling mass roars over farm buildings and houses as if they were made of cards. As the wall of water reaches Freijus, it sweeps away the town's main bridges. It bowls over a 4-car passenger train as if it were a toy.
D'un seul coup, il n'y a plus de lumière.
All at once, there was no more light, no electricity, and everyone thought they had been hit by a blackout.
Panne d'électricité.
When they heard the roar of the water, they realized that a disaster was in the making.
Ils se sont rendus compte qu'il arrivait un désastre.
In her home in the old town, Marthe Sepi hears people running and shouting in the streets.
We had military camps nearby, and sometimes the soldiers fought amongst themselves. So we opened the windows just to see what was happening. And across the street, one of our neighbors was shouting, "The dam! The dam fell down!" I woke up my daughter, and it seemed to me that the water was going to reach us. We knew that the dam was big and that it was full. And we went out on the street with everyone else. Everybody was leaving their homes. We were petrified.
A giant arm of water curls around the hill on which the old town stands, washing over the lowlands below.
The water had an amazing force. Nothing could stop it. It engulfed the plains and took off everything that was there, even several factories, including one where they made cement pipes and tanks.
The wave continues past the town of Freijus and heads for the Mediterranean, carrying houses, cars, and people with it. It leaves survivors like André and Gilbert Marot stranded in a quagmire of water, mud, and death.
Il a appelé et il a entendu mon frère second qui était.
He called out, and he heard my youngest brother, who had pulled himself into a tree in front of the house. They were able to talk, and when the water calmed completely, my oldest brother, my brother André, went down with the blanket and got into the tree, and they spent the night together, waiting for help.
Il est descendu avec la couverture et monté sur le platane, et ils ont passé la nuit tous les deux en attendant les secours.
With no electrical power, there is little anyone can do in the pitch black of night. For those who are safe on higher ground, tomorrow is another day. But for many, tomorrow will never come. Thursday morning, December 3rd, 1959. 15-year-old Michelle Marot wakens to another day at the private school she attends during the week. But this morning, something is different.
Et au petit matin, j'entendais des bruits autour de moi.
Early that morning, I heard my roommates moving around, and this was unusual. I asked myself, why were they whispering all around me? So we all got up like usual, and we had our breakfast. They were all there with their newspapers. Every time I came near one of them, they would fold the newspapers, and I didn't understand.
Elle repliait le journal. Et je ne comprenais pas. Et la directrice de l'établissement m'a fait appeler et m'a dit, voilà le barrage de Freijus.
And the principal of the school called me and told me that the dam in Freijus had exploded. We have concerns about your parents, but we have no news for you right now.
Pour l'instant, on n'a pas plus de nouvelles.
The collapse of the Malpasset Dam has left a path of destruction, starting at the dam site 7 kilometers north of Freijus and ending at the Mediterranean coast. The lake that stretched for almost 10 kilometers behind the dam has disappeared, like water drained from a bathtub. Little remains of the dam, perhaps a tenth of what it once was. Down below, the Freijus Valley is a paddy field of water and red mud.
Alors là, il n'y avait plus rien. Les arbres étaient tombés.
The trees were uprooted. Trucks were stacked one on top of the other. My husband came back around 2 hours later saying, "You wouldn't believe it. You can't even imagine."
Yet, there are those who are already organizing the rescue of survivors, the recovery of the dead, and the overwhelming task of giving aid to those who have lost everything.
N'est-ce pas? Et il fallait tout de suite prendre des mesures pour venir.
We had to immediately take measures to help the victims of the disaster, to organize shelter, to organize meals.
Il fallait leur donner à manger. Il y a eu un moment.
So right after the people were completely beaten, they had to immediately roll up their sleeves and come to the aid of the population.
Et venir en aide des populations.
L'armée nous a prêté des hélicoptères.
The Army lent us helicopters. The helicopters flew over to try and see bodies that were there. And then we got trucks and we transported these bodies to the morgue.
Parce que dans la plaine, il avait beaucoup plu. Cette terre est argileuse.
In the plains, the ground was made of clay, and we couldn't even stand on our feet. So people had small boats, fishing boats. They took out their small boats and recovered the people from the mud.
Among the first to be rescued are André and Gilbert Merot, who have spent the night stranded above the muck and the mire.
They were there together in the tree from midnight to about 5 in the morning. Authorities arrived in little boats and were able to find them.
Rose Duteau and her family are among those safe on the high ground of the old town, but one family member is not among them.
So my husband, my brother, and a friend of ours decided to go up there. The next morning they found him at the foot of the dam, and we had a lot of grief, because if he wouldn't have gone to feed the dogs, he wouldn't be dead. He wouldn't have been taken by the wave.
Michel Merot also receives bad news.
Donc la directrice m'a appelé une nouvelle fois pour me dire
The principal called me again to tell me that my aunt was waiting for me, and everyone had died except for my 2 brothers who were saved. There, that's it. It's always hard to talk about, even 45 years later.
il faut pas que je me fasse pleurer. Non, il faut pas.
They found my father right away. My mother wasn't found till 3 or 4 days later.
While officials try to identify the dead, medical personnel try to treat the living.
The hospitals could not adequately care for them all. There was no electricity, and the doctors had to use flashlights.
Fortunately, food, water, and clothing pour in from neighboring communities and from countries across Europe as government agencies work to restore rail and road links to the Freijus region. In the end, 421 are confirmed dead, although many believe the count to be much higher.
J'étais persuadé, je suis persuadé qu'il y a encore des corps qui n'ont pas été retrouvés.
I am convinced there are still bodies which have not yet been found and are somewhere in the holes, in the mud.
A commission of engineers finds the design of the dam to be satisfactory, and tests show that joints between the remaining concrete and the canyon walls are still strong. The cause lies not in the dam, but in the rock itself. Tests show that a thin clay-filled seam adjacent to the dam's left bank is composed mainly of mica, which breaks down more easily under pressure.
Ils ont fait des essais en laboratoire.
They took some samples and found that when they put them in water, they would dissolve, and that caused the dislocation of the wall.
2 consecutive commissions find that preliminary geological surveys of the Reyrin Valley were inadequate. A government engineer is implicated in the investigation, as is dam designer André Coyne. Legal battles continue, ultimately leading to the acquittal of those originally indicted and leaving the question of responsibility unanswered. Although the Malpasset Dam is never rebuilt, its lesson impacts the construction of future projects, confirming that an arch dam, no matter how dependable a design, is only as strong as the rock that supports it. The impact on the people of the Reyrin Valley is much more far-reaching.
My mother was very unhappy, and she died 2 years after father, of sorrow. She never got over it.
My brothers and I decided very quickly that we wanted to move back to the farm, all 3 of us, because we were very much in need of one another.
If there is a silver lining to the disaster, it is that it offers the region a chance to rebuild and restructure its economy.
En réalité, compte tenu de l'importance des dons qu'a Freijus reçus,
the donations that Freijus received, the money, was a new start for Freijus. It was good for the economy. The new highway brought a flow of people, many curious about the disaster, and it set off the hotel and restaurant industry here. Effectively, it brought economic development to Freijus.
Just a year and a half earlier, another day also changes lives forever. It is June 17th, 1958, and Vancouver bridge builder Bill Stroud picks up some of his co-workers, as he does every morning. Before the day's end, everyone in Bill's car will be seriously injured or dead. June 17th, 1958, a bright, warm Tuesday in Vancouver, British Columbia. In Vancouver Harbor, a giant steel skeleton reaches out from the shores as high steel workers scurry along the girders of what will be the new Second Narrows Bridge. Lou Lassard is one of them. With 10 years of iron work behind him, the 31-year-old is already a front-end foreman on the huge project.
I built bridge in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I built some in New Brunswick. I built some in Quebec. So when I heard about that great big bridge to be built in Vancouver, I thought that was a challenge. That was in my blood. That was the biggest bridge. I want to be part of it.
Lou has a lot of respect for the men who work under him, including young Bill Stroud. Bill is a front-end connector, responsible for joining the huge girders that make up the bridge framework.
When a big 60 or 70-ton girder comes up, they steer it in and they fit that all together, and as quickly as you can, you put the lining up pins in to hold it temporary. Norm Atkinson and Colin Glendenny was the other connectors on the other side. And Joe Crush and I was connecting. They always had the same partner. And you know what they were capable of, and you trusted them thoroughly.
Joe Crush is not only Bill's partner, but also a good friend, one of the men Bill picks up every morning on his way to work. Since moving here 8 months ago, life has been looking up for Joe, his wife, and their 4 children. But Joe also knows how dangerous his job is. He and the other men work with nothing between them and the churning waters of the Burrard Inlet.
On those days, no safety net, no harness, no safety line. The only safety that was a life jacket in case you fall underwater.
19-year-old steelworker Gary Poirier is not so self-assured. In a dream the night before, he watched the bridge collapse and saw himself sliced in 2 by a steel cable. Perhaps the dream is fueled by the fact that 4 men have fallen to their deaths since the decision was made to build another bridge. While 2 bridges already span the narrows of the vast Burrard Inlet, they can barely handle the traffic between Vancouver and communities on the North Shore.
The reason it's called the Second Narrows is because there was a First Narrows, and the First Narrows is at Stanley Park at the Lionsgate Bridge. The Second Narrows is the narrower of the 2, and consequently the current runs through there in just a horrific rate.
The current has always been a problem for the original Second Narrows Bridge. Completed in 1925, it is redesigned in the 1930s after being damaged by ships pushed into it by swirling harbor waters. It remains a rickety antique that must be raised to allow ships to pass underneath.
It went up and down for every fishing boat with a mast. That was every boat over a certain size had a mast. Up and down it went, every barge that went through there. And when she went up, that meant that nobody went across. The trains didn't go and the cars didn't go.
The builders of the new bridge don't intend to make the same mistakes. The new Second Narrows Bridge is a cantilever design, with anchor spans and concrete piers providing support for the cantilever arms that will join over the harbor. By Tuesday, June 17, 1958, the 17 piers that will serve as foundation for the bridge are in place, and 4 approach spans coming from the North Shore have been completed. A 5th, the North Anchor Span, is in the process of being erected. It is supported at one end by Pier 14. The other end is held up by what bridge builders call a falsework.
The falsework is a temporary support. When you put a bridge, you got 2 solid permanent foundation. If you cannot make one girder long enough to reach between one to the other one, you have to use many shorter sections. And each one of them have to get a set of crutches until you sit that piece.
The North Anchor Span is already held up by one falsework and is just 24 hours away from reaching a second temporary support.
The piece we were putting in now was the one before last, before we would be sitting on solid steel. Another week, we would be sitting on permanent concrete foundation. We were that close.
Engineers responsible for design specifications, including the falseworks, are on the bridge that day. Veteran Murray McDonald is one of the most experienced bridge builders in the country. His assistant, John McKibben, is a recent graduate who has only been with the company for a year. Connectors Bill Stroud, Joe Crush, Norm Atkinson, and Colin Glendinning are all on the North Anchor Span, 30 meters above the Burrard Inlet.
There's other fellows that were inside the hollow steel girders, bolting up, and that's all they did. Just wearing earplugs and inside, and they don't see nothing.
Big John Olynyk is one of them. At 6'1", he is jammed inside one of the girders as partner Al McPherson inches over to give him a hand. In the water below, Bill Lasko mans a barge equipped with life jackets. It's his job to rescue anyone who might fall into the harbor during working hours. 79 men work on the north end of the bridge, including a gang of painters covering the adjacent span with silver paint. Many of them are tied to the girders by safety belts. It is 3:40 p.m., less than an hour from quitting time.
I myself was on one of the leg of the derrick, which is about 10-15 feet higher than the bridge, doing the signal to pick the load. I just give the signal to pick the thing up. As we're picking the load, that's what that's happened.
In a nearby neighborhood, 9-year-old Alan Safrick plays baseball with friends.
I was pitching to this guy named Ron Vellman. Man, he hit this ball way over the edge, and I turned to look and see this ball go, and it was just like a shunt. It just shook me like that, right? It was something that we never heard before, you know?
There was a high-pitch steel snapping. You cannot describe it. When you fire a rifle there, that's putting your sound like this. Then there was no need of sound, there was come.
With the noise, the anchor span shudders, then slumps a few meters. It pauses for just a heartbeat. Then, with another convulsive spasm, the south end of the span plummets toward the waters below, taking men and equipment with it.
I was just hanging on with my shoulder on the diagonal bracing, like that. And then when the bridge went, I still must have hung onto that cable because my hand was all torn. I was immediately knocked off, and probably Norm too. And we went right down into the water.
As the span falls, bolter Al McPherson is killed instantly by the crush of heavy steel. His partner, John Olenek, is still inside the hollow girder. The anchor span's violent fall cracks the concrete foundation of its support pier. The movement pulls the pier out from under the adjacent span, causing it to fall as well. The 25 painters working on it go too, some still strapped to falling steel.
When the noise echoed into the mountains there in the inlet, we ran to the edge of the field and we were like, what happened, right? And there was a man, and he says, the bridge is gone. It's gone. And we were like, the bridge is gone?
Tuesday, June 17th, 1958. Just after 3:40 p.m., 16-year-old Vancouver scuba diver Phil Newton gathers his equipment for a salvage job.
We had an illegal tugboat radio, and we listened to the tug calls, and very often we would pick up salvage jobs, and we were listening to somebody was screaming in the radio. It's falling, the whole thing's falling, you know. So of course we stopped dead in our tracks, and there was all kinds of static, and then someone else cut in and said, yeah, it looks like the whole section swung in. There's people in the water. We need to get help right away. So we called the police right away and asked for a police escort. We told them the route we were taking and started off for the Second Narrows.
The scene that Phil Newton races to at the bridge site is one of chaos, destruction, and death.
It was like looking at a tinker toy. When you were from where we were looking down on it, it was as if somebody had just made a mechano set, and then some 300-pound man had jumped off the chair on the top of it.
Men who survive the sudden collapse of steel now cling to broken girders or fight for their lives in the rushing current of Vancouver Harbor. Ironworker Bill Stroud falls 30 meters into the icy water.
You'd have all this heavy equipment, so when the bridge went down, you just went right straight to the bottom. When they hit the water, I was in between the two main parts of the bridge, and it stirred up so much mud and sand that there's no way could you see up and down. And I'm a good swimmer, and I thought, geez, I'm going to drown, you know.
From his perch high above the bridge, Foreman Lou Lassard falls 60 meters into the harbor.
The impact was so much, the life jacket just fall apart and then as soon as I hit the water, I kind of feel blood coming to my nose and my throat when you break bone. I was pretty close from dying, you know. Then all in once, I can start to see a little bit of a ray. Like sometimes you see the sun perking through the cloud there, then I knew that was up that way. When I get up, I saw some big plane floating, so I managed to get one, but I found out I had broken out. Then I found another plane. I was holding on it.
Some distance away, 3 more survivors reach the surface: Norm Atkinson, Colin Glendenning, and Bill Stroud.
Everybody got rid of their tool belts, and I was able to unhook them and throw them in the water. When we come up out of the water, Norman, Colin, and I, there were so many scaffold planks. They were about 4 deep, and we had to pry them apart. And so I was able to lean there with our arms holding us up.
Steelworker Gary Poirier, who dreamt of his own death the night before, has also survived. He clings to a floating 2x4 and drifts with the current. Boatman Bill Lasco spends the next 6 hours navigating his safety barge through tangled girders, picking up men wherever he can find them. He is assisted by surveyor Art Pilon in a small fiberglass outboard. One of Art's first rescues is Lou Lassard.
He never asked any question. He just grabbed me and threw me in his boat. I was mad at him because broken leg, broken arm, damaged disc. He just grabbed me and threw me in.
For Phil Newton, the images are like nothing he has ever seen.
It was indescribable. There were people laying on the dock covered with canvases, obviously dead. There were people piled on top of each other. And there's one guy who had jumped from the bridge and landed on the pier and had sort of telescoped. The sides of his pants were burst open, and it was just a horror show.
Phil joins commercial and fire department divers already at the scene. Their first job is to try and save the life of Gordy McLean, who moments before was operating the diesel locomotive attached to the crane.
The top part of the cab was still above the water, but the bottom had crushed and was twisted. You know, the current was running at least 2 or 3 knots by the time we got there, and so it was very difficult to swim against it. The guy was just screaming. The water was about up to here on him. So I tried to get underneath and find out what was pinning him, and I couldn't get through, so I took my tank off and tried to push it ahead of me as long as my hoses would allow, but I still couldn't reach him.
Phil and another diver try to pry some of the lighter steel apart, but they can't move it. When they return to the top of the cab, they discover that it is already too late for operator Gordy McLean.
It was silent, and his hair was just floating on the top of the water, so he was gone.
Time is also running out for bolter John Olenek, trapped inside steel girders that have fallen into the water. His only avenue of escape is too small to get through.
He was in there, and no way to get him out. He had one arm and his head out, trying to get out that hole, and the big bugger couldn't get out of there, no way. And the bridge was still settling, and the tide was coming in.
Then, through the settling dust, Olenek sees a boat approaching. It carries a team of 6 welders who were working just blocks away when they heard the crash. In minutes, they are cutting away sections of Olenek's steel tomb, piece by piece. By the time they free him, he is having trouble keeping his face out of the water. By now, boats of all shapes and sizes are arriving to help with the rescue of the living and the retrieval of the dead.
You reach these sort of epiphanies, I suppose is the term, in your life where I really had never given thought to just how fragile human life is and how quickly it's snuffed out and how inconsequential you are when you're laying there, covered by a piece of canvas.
It is the single worst disaster in Vancouver's history. 20 bridge men are hospitalized, many with serious injuries. 18 more are dead. Most are killed before they hit the water. Among the dead is Bill Stroud's friend, Joe Crush, who leaves behind his wife and 4 young children.
They couldn't find him after the bridge went down for a long time, and there's steel piling that were pulled together in kind of a wedge form. And eventually somebody spotted him sitting in there with the head chopped off. He was floated right up into the top of the piling.
I'm sure there were lots of wife and kids and family worry what's happened today. 18 of them didn't come home that night, and another 20 in the hospital like me, they didn't come home.
Lou is one of the most seriously hurt that lived. They had to hoist him up maybe 30 feet, and they had a hold of his broken leg right up around his neck. That's how bad his leg was shattered. Norm had a broken neck, and Colin had broken legs. I had compressed fractures in my spine, 2 of them, and I broke some ribs on this side.
A Royal Commission of Inquiry investigates the cause of the tragedy. After only a few months, the commission releases its findings. The accident was caused by human error, a mathematical miscalculation made by the engineering team.
Our engineers, as a result of their analysis of the plans and so forth, reached a conclusion that there was a weakness in the design of the grillage at the foot of one of the falsework supports, the one that was furthest out. There was a young engineer, and he had the responsibility of designing the falsework. And the resident engineer, who was assigned or given the responsibility of checking the young engineer's work, and he missed the fact that the young engineer had used a wrong formula. And so it was under-designed, and it could not take the load that would be imposed on it. The grillage was under-designed. And both were on the bridge when it went down, and both died.
Just a thing, one small mistake could have caused so much problem to so many people. That's hard to believe, right? The minor little thing could cause so much a big tragedy like this.
On June 7th, 1960, the 2 ends of the Second Narrows Bridge are finally joined over the Burrard Inlet. Front-end connector Norm Atkinson is the first man to walk across.
I was the first one to cross on top of the boom and the crane. But after we put the real solid piece between the 2 members, I gave Norm the order to go across, to give him the glory to be the first man across the structure, because he was my best friend, and he deserved it.
The Second Narrows Bridge is officially opened on August 25th, 1960, just over 2 years after the accident. During the ceremony, the widow of one of the men killed unveils a plaque commemorating those lost during the bridge's construction.
We used to walk across when I was a kid, and we'd always stop there and hang out at that spot, you know. That was our favorite spot to rest there and check out the plaque. And it used to be very touching to us. It was quite a moving thing to think about those guys.
On June 17th, 1994, the name of the bridge over Vancouver Harbor was officially changed to the Ironworkers Memorial Second Narrows Crossing.
Every year, some of the survivors, some of the family, we go there, then we put a wreath there, then we have a few speech, then we have a few minutes of silence, then we got a roll call of all the members that lost their life on the bridge there. It's very sad when we go there. We feel like crying. Not that bad. That's our Canadian history, bad or good, that's his story.
Today, Freijus is a bustling tourist town, a gem in the crown of the French Riviera. Above it, vestiges of the Malpasset Dam stand side by side with remnants of its Roman past.
For a lot of Freijusiens, it is a reference. They don't say before 1960, they say before the dam or after the dam. It's a reference which surrounds all discussions about Freijus. I left adolescence and entered adulthood because of the dam. Life was short. You had to live it and live it fully.
It turned my life upside down and made everything else less important. It made me realize everything can be lost from one day to another. There were 500 deaths. Freijus must remember them.